Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Istituto Affari Internazionali for this public launch kick-off event of our joint project. Now, for those who will probably not be aware, joint is a project which formally began yesterday, in fact. It's a project that brings together 14 partners across Europe and the wider world, coordinated by YAI, 12 different countries involved in this project, and the aim is really that of understanding the way in which the European Union, it's a project funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 programme, and it really aims at understanding how the European Union can really become a more joined up actor in its role in the world. Perhaps some, if not many of you will recall the fact that the idea of a joined up European foreign policy has been a sort of leitmotif in European foreign policy debates for quite some time. It was heralded as one of the goals of the EU global strategy. And it has been, in a sense, it's really a notion that has been, interpreted through different words and practices over the years. But really, the idea of having greater consistency, greater coherence, ensuring that the way in which Europe acts is indeed more joined up, has really been a constant over the decades in the way in which Europe has tried to understand itself and its role in the world. Now, obviously, this depends to a large extent on the way in which the EU is organized internally. Relations between member states, relations between institutions, so the extent to which the EU, both vertically, horizontally, in fact diagonally, in whatever direction you may, it really is able to break many of the silos that really compartmentalize different forms of action and therefore impede the emergence of a coherent foreign policy. But then, of course, this also depends on the way in which the EU interacts with the wider world. And some of the actors that we're talking about are, of course, friends, they're partners and allies. Other countries, perhaps slightly less so. And yes, and yet we know that we are living in, and we will be living in, a world in which power is increasingly distributed, if you like, redistributed amongst different power centres. And therefore, if the EU is indeed to be a more joined up actor in the world, there is also a big question which surrounds the way in which it acts with or against other actors in the world, and the way in which it is perceived as being a coherent and joined up actor by them. So it's a real pleasure, it's a real honor to really introduce our panel today. I think we have a really stellar panel that will entertain us for the next hour and a half or so. We have Rosa Balfour, the Director of Carnegie Europe, Barbara Keyes, Professor of International History at the University of Durham, Yinhong, Professor of International Relations in Renmin University in China, Dimitri Trenin, an old friend, Director of Carnegie Moscow Center, and Rosa Parsi, Head of the Middle East and North Africa Program from the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. So without further ado, Rosa, another very good friend, let me perhaps turn to you first to give us your sense from, I guess, a European perspective, which is how this all starts, of how the EU is indeed and can navigate what we define as being a more complex and contested world. Rosa.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm going to spend the first few minutes to talk about my favorite topic, which is self-inflicted blows and the impact on its global role. I'll go through them very quickly, but I will start from the Eurozone crisis because it really damaged the EU's image as a model for prosperity, welfare, redistribution, quality. Then came this came with the Eurozone crisis, of course, and the way the EU handled it. Then came the annexation of Crimea and the eruption of conflict, several types of conflicts in the EU's neighbourhood, which underscored the lack of a willingness on the part of the EU to provide security for its neighbours and to look after them. Then we have, in parallel to this, a democratic backsliding within the European Union and a rise of right-wing populism, which has undermined the image which the EU had spent a lot of time in building as a global norms model, as a defender of human rights globally. In parallel, again, the refugee influx, where Europe really, its emphasis on keeping refugees out really underscored its double standards as far as migrant rights are concerned, and also a transactionalism in relations with third countries in demanding that they keep the migrants out and they look after the security of the EU's borders. Then, of course, we have Brexit, which underscored European Union fragmentation trends which existed. Having said this, I think we need to underline that in the Western Balkan countries which want to join the EU, Brexit hasn't actually had a negative impact on Europe's image. But nonetheless, it is an instance of political fragmentation. And finally, last but not least, to the coronavirus pandemic, this week, the Economist Intelligence Unit published a report underlining the degree to which the West as a whole is losing points in the global South in particular, and how Russia and China are very capable in exploiting the situation to gain geostrategic advantages through vaccine diplomacy. So we have a whole set of issues that have been keenly watched in other countries. I'll leave my co-panelists to talk about Russia, China, Iran, the US, etc. But in the global South, this has had an impact, and the debates there very much focusing on how geopolitical dynamics are actually undermining the power of Europe, the soft power of Europe. Nonetheless, there's still a spaces for action for the EU. I'm going to highlight them very briefly. The EU is still regarded as an important actor in supporting multilateralism, as a conflict mediator, as a peace proposer, as a counterbalance to geopolitical rivalry, as a donor, as an economic actor, and of course as a supporter of regional cooperations. So this emerges when you look at the debates taking place in the global South as a demand from the EU. So despite the setbacks, and despite the self-inflicted blows, there still are spaces for the EU to carve out a global role. Back in Brussels, I'd like to focus now on the debate that is taking place in Brussels and in European capitals. Of course, the debate, as ever, is politistic. We saw the new commission, it's not so new anymore, but at the end of 2019, a new commission, a new institutional phase came in, and the narrative was that this was going to be a geopolitical commission and that the EU was going to speak the language of power. Now, I think the latest diplomatic blunders really show that this is not really in the EU's cause. But I think there are other issues, other developments that are worthy of some interest. And the first is the strategic autonomy debate. There are several implications here. Now, we know very well that there are huge problems in terms of capabilities as far as security and defense is concerned. And we also know that there's a huge problem of political disunity, which, if anything, has been getting worse precisely because of those self-inflicted blows I mentioned earlier. But I'd like to just highlight, for the purpose of this conversation, the two potentially interesting aspects. The first is that we need to think of strategic autonomy as a relational concept, and not just about Europe going it alone, because then we fall into the trap of capacity and political will and are unable to get out of it. If we think of it as a relational concept, it means exploring the degree to which the EU can partner with others in order to achieve what it wants to achieve. It's about reformulating the way in which the EU engages with partners and engages around the world. The second interesting development comes from this morphing of this concept of strategic autonomy, which is born in the framework of NATO, really, and with respect to security and defense, and the degree to which it's morphing to embrace economics and geoeconomics. And here we're touching upon areas where the EU actually has some significant assets. If the EU can make a bridge between politics and economics, it can propose itself to the world with a set of different tools. Now, there are opportunities here, and there are also some risks. The opportunities, I think, to the degree to which international relations are becoming fluid. The great opportunity comes from the fact that there's been a change of administration in the US, which is focusing far more strongly on the concept of alliances as a means to push back on the decline of the West. And it also, there is an opportunity if the EU decides to be open to the world and to seek partnerships, variable partnerships with other countries, and not just countries, also multi-level partnerships. It can be, among civil society organizations or sub-state institutions or regional institutions. The EU actually has this multi-level structure. It can engage with partners in a multi-level way across the world through networks. So there are plenty of opportunities here, also to engage on issues in a more functional way rather than, it's all or nothing. The second opportunity, it comes from the linkage between politics and economics. And we've seen several developments here. We saw a couple of years ago a communication on strengthening the international role of the euro. There have been communications on raw materials. With the coronavirus, the debate has been hugely accelerated about trade, supply chains, etc. Here, again, it means connecting better with the EU's assets, such as regulation, such as trade. But there are also some risks because it means politicizing instruments that so far have been driven essentially by technocratic politics. So there are some risks related to that. If the driving forces behind this politicization are protectionist, are focusing on Europe first, are undermining all those instances and assets of soft power that I mentioned at the beginning, where it is that Europe still has global clout, is really in the field of solidarity, is in the field of rights, is in the field of building prosperity, is in the field of fighting the climate crisis. So the degree to which, the way in which these tools are used can determine the way in which the EU proposes itself to the global stage. Thank you, I'll leave it there.
Rosa, can I, in fact, before I turn to Barbara, can I actually ask you a quick follow-up question, given that, sort of in over the years of your own work, the question of sort of democracy, human rights has been an important part of what you've done. And the question that I've been asking myself recently is, in a sense, do we risk as Europeans kind of slightly being behind the curve now? I mean, it seems to me that yes, this used to be a sort of prominent dimension of what we did and what we stood for in the world. I mean, the whole sort of period in which we portrayed ourselves as being a normative power of sorts in the world. We kind of then went through a phase of kind of slightly forgetting about this, partly as a consequence of what happened with the Arab uprisings, partly as a consequence of the fact that the world was becoming a big, bad and ugly place, and then therefore we had to become more geopolitical. Partly because the United States kind of forgot about it, particularly over the course of the Trump administration, and we'll come to this with Barbara in a moment. Now the United States, with the Biden administration, puts values and democracy sort of back front and center of the idea of foreign policy. Do you feel that as Europeans, we kind of risk being, in a sense, behind the curve on this point, where in a sense we have been at the forefront?
Yes, I do think the EU is behind the curve on this particular issue. And it hasn't, my sense is that it hasn't made up its mind as to where it wants to go. I think the US is building an alliance to counter authoritarianism. And there are two issues. The first is the sort of principled one. The second is the tactical one. I think the EU in principle is as a majority. I mean, we still need to think about the EU as a contested polity, right? But I think there would be a majority in the EU to favour countering authoritarianism. But I think in tactical terms, the EU differs quite significantly from the US. It wants to go, it's focusing, if you listen to Borrell and the Commission on issues such as Russia and Turkey, the emphasis is all on de-escalation, which means that the EU is willing to give on something. The second point is, I think there will come a point where a choice might be inevitable for the US, for the EU, and for all those who want to fight authoritarianism to choose between, it might become necessary to make choices between how authoritarian regimes are repressing rights internally and how they are encroaching on rights externally. And again, that could be a fraction point for a hypothetical coalition in fighting authoritarianism. But indeed, the EU has lost quite a lot of mileage on this front because of its own backsliding internally and because of the politics of foreign policy, which essentially is a bargain between member states. And we are seeing, especially with the departure of Britain, the mercantilistic dimension of EU politics taking precedence. They're stronger at the moment, as opposed to what used to be a coalition of Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, with Britain weighing in as well, many instances, which was much more in favor of global human rights. So that these, it's both a reflection of internal politics, but also a preference for different tactics. But ultimately, the EU's goal for its own survival is to support the rules-based and multilateral order. And so, there's all this values versus interest debate. Well, actually, they're very much interconnected because, the multilateral order is a values-based order, but it's also in the EU's interest. It would not survive as a regional organization without that supporting framework.
Yes, indeed. Now, Barbara, let me turn to you now. Sort of, Rosa was kind of rightly mentioning the United States, the fact that indeed now we have an administration in the United States that puts partnership and alliance at the core of its foreign policy, and obviously, sort of, first amongst which are Europeans. Which kind of marks a welcome break from the last 4 years. But perhaps sort of scratching a little bit beneath the surface of this kind of, commitment to partnering with Europe because we share values to strengthen the rules-based multilateral system and all good things. If you could give us a sense of how you think the United States is thinking about Europe, particularly in relation also to this idea that in order for Europe to be a good partner to the United States, to what extent is there an expectation that Europeans assume greater responsibility, greater risk? In Europe, we tend to kind of translate this into the debate on strategic autonomy, which at the same time kind of ruffles feathers at times across the Atlantic. So to kind of give it, is this just semantics? I mean, is there something more behind it? And how to really materialize a strengthened partnership across the Atlantic?
So I think there are two broad ways to look at it. One is a sort of in principle view, and then a sort of in practice view. And in principle, I think the US is eager to see a more assertive Europe, and particularly an EU that's less dependent on the US for its own security, which has been, of course, a long-term theme in US attitudes toward Europe, goes back to the 60s, but is very much reinforced by several factors. And the first is Biden and many of his top officials have a very Atlanticist orientation, and they see the EU, in Biden's phrase from 2013, as an indispensable partner of first resort. And of course, as a corollary, you want a strong and capable partner. And as you indicated, it's a stark departure from the Trump administration's view of the EU as a competitor, seeing the EU as an entity formed to rip off the US. But so the second factor is America's internal problems, and we're all very familiar with those. Biden's desire to focus on healing a sick society and a sick economy, push the administration toward a position where the help of allies is not just welcome, but really needed. And I would add a sort of psychological factor. I think Democrats in the US feel quite besieged at home, and they very much believe in this rhetoric of shared values with the EU. And this makes the EU almost a refuge from critics at home, and I would argue predisposes the administration toward a position of trust and amity toward the EU. So in principle, and I think Rosa is among those who've made this point, a stronger EU is a stronger partner in a very challenging world in which the US very much needs strong partners. But when we get to practicalities, of course, difficulties emerge. And the first is some skepticism about whether the EU will, whether the EU has the will and the capacity to take on more responsibility. You've mentioned the debate over strategic autonomy. There's a recent article by two scholars in international security that claims to find it's extremely unlikely that strategic autonomy, defined in a straightforward military sense, can be achieved. And I think there's a danger of a disjuncture between the Biden administration's expectation that the EU will move more vigorously in ways that it started to do when it was faced with Trump, but that in fact the EU will lapse into a more complacent stance, no longer confronted with a sort of imminent, adversary in the form of Trump, which will then lead to disappointment and frustration in the US about continued insufficient defense spending and inadequate capacity to burden share. And indeed, pressure from the Biden administration on these fronts could echo Trump very much. And of course, frustration in this general area predates Trump. So a second area of practical friction is on the economic front, of course. And here, the very fact that the Biden administration genuinely feels a community of values with Europe could exacerbate tension over what they see as the EU's failure to properly assess the threat from China. And I think we already saw an expectation at the end of the year when Jake Sullivan, as the incoming national security advisor, apparently thought he could, deter or postpone the comprehensive investment agreement with China from being concluded in principle, or at least, raise the issue implicitly of human rights, and then was ignored. So there's a potential clash. There is a sort of emergent clash there. And the final major area, I think, for a clash of expectations is that Biden is likely to expect that Europe will understand the reasons behind his protectionist Buy America agenda and the domestic constraints that are leading him to maintain those unilateral tariffs on steel and aluminum. Indeed, his Secretary of Commerce has said that those tariffs are very effective. And in fact, Europe may not be so understanding. So there are lots of specific issues in the relationship, challenges around digital taxation, extraterritorial sanctions, JCPOA, reform of the WTO, lots of things. But I'll just leave it there and say that, we all know that Trumpism was not repudiated. We could conceivably see a return of a Trump-style administration in just 4 years. So it is important not to dither when this window of opportunity exists.
Well, thank you for that. And perhaps before I turn to Xi now, let me ask you, because I think this kind of also enables us to make the transition to China. I think you're absolutely right, Barbara. I mean, there are plenty of reasons why in practice that recommitment to partnership and alliance could not necessarily go wrong, but simply not fully materialize, yes, there's on the one hand the sort of frustration on the security and defense front, which I think in a sense is kind of almost deeper than the kind of mere question of defense spending. I mean, I think that even personally, I feel that the even more serious problem is the fact that even when we do have the capabilities, we don't actually want to use them. When there are sort of plenty of conflicts and crises sort of in and around Europe, we don't really do much about them. And so in a sense, it's to me, it's more of a problem that has to do with an unwillingness to take risk rather than only take responsibility, if you like, which is which causes the frustration. Of course, on the other on the flip side of the coin, and you sort of rightly mentioned the comprehensive agreement on investment with China, it is also a question of, let me put it in terms of respect. Because indeed, on the side of the United States, if, and it's a big if, Europeans were to demonstrate that they're willing to kind of, take more responsibility and more risk, well, part of that contract has to do with the fact that at times they will do things that the United States will not fully agree with. Because otherwise the contract simply doesn't hold. I mean, you can't simply say, well, I want you to take more responsibility to do more what I want you to do, because it just doesn't hold water. So I'm just kind of really wondering on this respect part of the equation, perhaps in reference to the example on the comprehensive agreement with China, but one can imagine other examples moving forward. To what extent do you think that there is a sort of growing maturity within the US foreign policy establishment, that these are two sides of the same coin?
I guess I think it's a bit early to say, very authoritatively, but I do think we're in obviously a transitional moment when US hegemony is, we're transitioning from a period when we had a sort of hyperpower to one of a much more multipolar world, and it's difficult always for the hegemon to adjust to that. And I think it will be tricky, especially when if you think about China, the US just thinks that Europe has the wrong view. So it's not like there's scope for differences of opinion where there's you can respect people who have a different opinion when there's a sort of right and wrong view. And I think the US has a long history of having a kind of Manichaean view of the world in which disagreement is not tolerated well.
Yes, absolutely. She, let me make the sort of move to you now, and in a sense sort of ask you, I mean, I think if we're thinking about China from a European perspective, I think we can really tell a story about the fact that there has been this growing awakening of sorts in Europe as to what kind of international actor China really is. If I can perhaps caricature this a little bit, it seems to me that, up until I would say, 7, 8 years ago, China was essentially viewed as an actor that, yes, had a pretty assertive agenda when it came to East Asia, South China Sea, everything that we know in the region, but that essentially what China was doing westwards was of an economic nature, and it was kind of, relatively teddy bearish. And that view has changed, I think, quite fundamentally. I think it sort of started changing, probably around 2016, 2017, I would say. I mean, this growing recognition that particularly the Belt and Road Initiative was not just an economic project, it had a very clear strategic edge to it. And I would say particularly then over the course of the pandemic, the way in which China has been, in a sense, sort of trying to capitalize on the pandemic politically. I mean, earlier, Rosa was making reference to this when it came to both China and Russia. So I think in many respects there has been a hardening, if you like, of views on China in the EU. Of course, there is still the recognition that China is a fundamentally important actor, not only economically, but ultimately for, if you like, the establishment of international order. So there is very clearly a recognition that when it comes to the main challenges of our age, from pandemic through to climate, one needs to work with China. But there is at the same time, in a sense, we no longer have our rose-tinted lenses when we look at China. And I'm just wondering, if you like, from China's perspective, how do you view this kind of Europe coming of age, if you like, when it comes to its relations with China? I mean, do you see it simply as a Europe full of contradictions? Where do you see this relationship heading?
Thank you very much, Nathalie, and it's my great pleasure to be here and to discuss such a topic as Europe in the complex and contested world from the perspective of some other major powers, including China, and for which I would like to pay especially my gratitude to Ricardo. And I think that Nathalie, we have a common opinion that there is a hardening, a just hardening of the EU-China relationship. And EU have a much more negative opinion about China. And then, for example, compared with 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, China same have a much hardening and negative opinion about the EU and its major powers. I would like to talk about the European Union and China in the perspective of a further downturn track of relationship. At this moment and in the future, because of their independent decisions, the influence from the United States and interaction between the two things, the EU and its major member states take and will continue to take, I believe, positions on most major prominent issues relating to China, largely same or familiar with those taken by the United States and its maritime allies. That means Japan, Great Britain, Australia, and Canada. Or in other words, much more agreements than disagreements with the latter. And these major prominent issues are Taiwan, South China Sea, US-Japan military alliance, and East China Sea. The Accord on Indo-Pacific and its strategic political connection with NATO. China-US civil arms race, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, disputes on trade and industrial policies, high-tech decoupling and checking, and competition for ideological clots. And we finally claimed cyber attack and disinformation. So much issues. You can see that the situation between EU and China is confrontational rivalry, and although in some degree a little less severe than that between China and the United States and its maritime allies. Even if there would be no influence from the United States and all decided independently by EU and its major member states, I believe their position and related actions would be also largely confrontation or rivalry with China, or with a less degree comparing with the US and its maritime allies. Furthermore, European Union and its major member states have been quite pleased or even a little exciting about the Biden administration's intensive attention and the highly conscious respect paid to them. And so it's inevitable, more receptive to the influence from Washington. It's true that on the fewer issues of trade with China and investment to China and addressing climate change and the commitments in principle to multilateralism and global governance and Iranian nuclear development, and the EU and its major members hold the most similar positions and have regular cooperation with China. These are, of course, important and valued by both China and Europe. However, I have to point out, they will not, or at least will not likely, have protracted decisive influence upon China-European relations. Moreover, even these accommodation and cooperation are often directly or indirectly intertwined with complicated competitions, strategic, political, diplomatic, and ideological. And currently, one prominent matter is China-EU Comprehensive Agreement of Investment, CAI. It's difficult to believe CAI could pass the test of years-long practice of implementation. Even one doesn't mention the nearly bleak prospect of its passing through the European Parliament. Moreover, Europe definitely put major improvement of friendship with the United States under Biden president as a priority over experiences with China. At the strategic, military, and human rights fronts with every China, EU is obviously moving nearer to the United States since the beginning of this year. And at the present, no one can be sure in any degree that the further alienation between Europe and China would not accompany with the even further deterioration of China-US relationship, or across the region. So for me, and not only it's very clear that the political prospect between Washington and Beijing is bleak, but also, and partly because of this, and relationship in general, and between Beijing and Brussels, and would be something far from wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Xi, for that, I think, very sober view of the prospect of European-Chinese relations. I must say that I find myself very much in agreement with, in a sense, with the sort of structural trends that you point to, and on this, perhaps, I would like to turn to Dimitri. Because in many respects, she basically, I mean, once upon a time, by once upon a time, I mean, 2010s, so not that long ago, there was this idea, this notion that I think Russia was also very, and is, I think, to an extent, very fond of, that the world was moving towards multipolarity. Where indeed we had sort of turned the page of US hegemony, and that power was being shifted and redistributed to different power centers, of which obviously China was one, but Russia was also another one. And I think in some respects, one can still make that argument, but there's a sort of an overarching argument on top of that, which I think is becoming increasingly clear, and I think was also increasingly clear in Xi's remarks, i.e. the idea that, yes, indeed, there may be different power centers, but at the end of the day, we are crystallizing in a sort of new bipolarity of sorts, in which, as Xi was saying, on one side, you do see particularly with the Biden administration in the US, this kind of, Europe and the United States coming together, and also sort of looking at this new confrontation through the lens of political systems, basically. What is, at the end of the day, the political system that best delivers to its citizens? So, it is ultimately a competition between democracy and I'm not quite sure what to call, sort of different forms of, if you like, authoritarian or autocratic systems on the other side. Now, and obviously where the main power center on the other side is China, it's not Russia. So much in the same way as, in the sense, Europe plays second fiddle to the United States, Russia plays second fiddle to China. And in many respects, I assume that this is a picture that Russians may not be very fond of, perhaps in the same way as Europeans may not be very fond of the idea of being second fiddle to the United States. But I was just wondering from your perspective, and if also you could give us a sense of how the Russian foreign policy debate on this macro question is evolving, and what the implications are of this picture for the future of Russian-European relations, as well as perhaps a few words on Russia-China relations themselves.
Thank you, Nathalie. I think that when the debate started on multipolarity in Russia, that was somewhere in the mid-1990s, the view that developed then was a fairly simplified view of the world happily transforming itself to a more equilibrated system. This debate in Russia started when it became clear to the more far-sighted people in Russia and in the West that Russia's integration into the Euro-Atlantic community was not going to happen. Was not going to happen for two basic reasons. Europe would not think of integrating Russia, too big, too different, too backward, people would say, unmanageable, not really worth a lot. For the United States, Russia was in the mid-1990s, yesterday's snow, basically, a country sometimes to be humored, but not more. Essentially an irrelevant power. On the Russian side, and certainly they did not want to have Russia in the tent, because knowing fairly well Russia's national character, they suspected, rightly I think, that once inside the tent, meaning NATO, Russia would start proactively looking for allies, undermining US hegemony within NATO, and essentially leading to NATO unraveling. So there was no, and on the Russian side, very important, I think the elites discovered that both the upper echelon of Russian society and the bulk of Russian society would not accept anyone above them. They would not accept US leadership. And accepting US leadership, as Europe did, was essentially the sine qua non condition for acceding to the Euro-Atlantic Alliance or the West. So Russia was essentially left out of that system and did not want to join that system. So multipolarity opened a way for Russia to think of itself as a great power, not a superpower, not an equal of the United States, but a country in its own right, with its own sphere of influence, with its own voice on the global scene, with its nuclear arsenal, with its UN Security Council seat, and all that. So I said that this was a fairly simplistic discussion. It was, and then multipolarity in Russia in the late 90s and through the 2000s was essentially used as a form of rejection of US hegemony. That is what it was. So people did not elaborate very much. So I think that it dawned on two things dawned on Russia in the last decade. One was with the Ukraine crisis, that a road to greater Europe, including Russia, a road to Russia's not integration, but some kind of an association, some kind of a friendly, non-hostile relationship with the West. That road was barred for a long time. The other road that was barred was having its own sphere of influence, reconstituting the empire under a different name. So those were the two big takeaways from the mid-10s. Now, the big takeaway from the late 10s was, as you mentioned, the rise of Sino-US bipolarity. And you said something which is very often, which I often hear in the West, which I sometimes feel in China, and which some people use in Russia, this second fiddle thing, that Russia is already occupying a position next to China that Europe is occupying next to the United States. I think that this analogy does not hold much water, frankly. There's no question that China is so much bigger than Russia, that Russia increasingly depends on China in important economic spheres. But still, I wouldn't take the argument a bit too far. First of all, I see no impact of that increased reliance on China. Or let's say I use the word dependence. I think I should have used the word reliance. So this increased reliance on China does not constitute Russia following China. There's a lot of areas where China and Russia collaborate. They take similar views because, among other things, they are both being pressured by the United States. Perhaps the biggest achievement of Russia's foreign policy in the last 35 years was ending the conflict with China and constituting a relationship that exists today, and which is somewhere above what you normally call strategic partnership, and I would say well below an alliance. So it's a relationship in which both countries vow not to do anything against each other, but they do not have to follow each other. And there are a number of issues where China and Russia do not take similar views. China does not recognize Crimea as part of Russia, does not recognize Abkhazia as an independent entity. Russia takes a neutral stance on the South China Sea, similarly on the East China Sea. There are some differences between China and Russia on such issues as Central Asia, relations with India, Russian arms to Vietnam. The strength and resilience of the Sino-Russian relationship rests in the two leaderships being able to manage those differences so that they do not materially damage the relationship. So I think that this is a fairly solid relationship when I look, let's say, 10 years ahead, maybe 15 years ahead. But this is the time that I allot to the present leadership of Russia. And this is also the time that I think Mr. Xi Jinping will stay as the top leader of China. So in this new bipolarity, I think Russia is trying to strike a balance, to take an how shall I put it? To keep an equilibrium between Washington and Beijing, but not equidistance. Russia is closer to Beijing for a number of very serious reasons, but Russia is not joining with China in its confrontation with the United States, much as China is not joining Russia in its confrontation with the United States. So we have an interesting situation in which those two powers, China and Russia, have the same big adversary, the United States, and they wage two confrontations in parallel. There is a degree of coordination, but not all that much. In many areas, China and Russia work either side by side or in parallel, but they do not necessarily collaborate, coordinate rather. And lastly, you talked about competition of political systems and rules-based order. I think one important thing to be recognized, I believe, is that a rules-based order can only become universal when all the major, and I would say all the other powers that have the capability to undermine that order sign on to that. Otherwise, it will remain a Western / associated countries order, an international order, a very important very widely spread order, but not a universal one. And I find it difficult to understand, to accept that China will accept, or Russia for that matter, but China is so much bigger and so much more important in that sense, the rules-based order that the West is offering. So let me stop here.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dimitri. I mean, it's only actually at some point you used a phrase that I also often used, but obviously in relation to Europe and the US. When you said, you know, we want we're not equidistant, so we know who we stand closer to, and obviously that is the United States, but we want to make sure that we are the ones determining what our equilibrium is, which is basically what the whole strategic autonomy debate is all about. So, I mean, in a sense, kind of, and yes, you know, what you were saying at the beginning of your remarks, I totally share. Indeed, there are a number of really key points where one can make the argument that, you know, there isn't a full alignment between Russia and China. I do still ask myself the question. In fact, I would like to ask very quickly before I turn to Elizabeth, both you and she, to what extent is this a temporary situation? I mean, you know, is the destination one of greater convergence in the sense of Russia converging towards China, as China in itself perhaps starts becoming more assertive in its demands on Russia? So, you know, this is the sort of snapshot of today and perhaps in the next few years, but perhaps looking ahead toward, you know, over the next decades, we may be getting to a situation where for Russia to determine its equilibrium may become increasingly difficult, more difficult over time.
Well, if I may start, Nathalie, I just, let me show you just a sec. I just done a book. It's fresh from the publisher.
Fantastic.
It's called A New Balance of Power, Russia in Search of a Foreign Policy Equilibrium. So the book is all about that. So you hit the nail on its head. I think that Russia is having tried and failed, and this is in many ways a tragedy. But in some other ways, it could lead to rejuvenation. Tried and failed integration into Europe, when Russia thought of itself as part of Europe. This period is over, and now Russia thinks of itself as being apart from Europe. Having said that, Russia as an independent unit of some size, but not part of any big, truly major unit like the United States with its system of alliances, like the European Union, like China, it still needs to keep its sovereignty, because this is in the DNA. They did not accept the United States. They will not accept China if China ever wanted to. It doesn't want to. And I think that shows China's wisdom. Not to want to lord over Russia, not to be assertive toward Russia, because that does not bode well for the relationship. A country that could say no to the United States can say no to anyone in this world and pay the price, as Russia has been paying for some time. So this equilibrium means maintaining relations primarily with the main power centers in Eurasia, where Russia is. That means China, that means Europe, that means India, that means the Muslim world, and that means the United States, which is present all over. Now, how to get from where we are to where we might wish to be, that's very much the subject matter of that book. It analyzes the previous 35 years and thinks 10 years ahead. So basically, I think that responding to the question that I so far have ignored, I think that the way forward in Russia's relations with Europe would be to construct something like neighborliness. Not good neighborliness. I don't think we will become good neighbors for some time, but neighborliness, which would basically mean that we live side by side and not cause too much trouble for each other. That means dealing with security issues first. Of course, you need to include the United States through NATO, because that's not that's not part of what the European Union is doing. It means something which will be difficult for the Europeans, a sort of recognition of diversity. Russia will not be a Western-style democracy in the 21st century, I don't think. And in other words, investing too much in this democracy versus authoritarianism battle may be a losing proposition in many ways. Unlike communism, authoritarianism has much deeper roots, and it's much more resilient. And thirdly, cooperation on a number of issues of common interest and sharing actually a lot of values, save political values and some family values are widely shared between Russians and Europeans today. Of course, that means coming to terms with Ukraine. That is a very important obstacle for a healthy relationship between Russia and Europe. But I think that should be the work primarily of Russians and Ukrainians. I don't think that a third party would be able to bring peace between Moscow and Kiev. And both Moscow and Kiev are still very far from basically reaching a deal on their future relationship. Sorry for talking so long.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for advertising my book. I'm really embarrassed.
You rightly did, Dimitri.
Yeah, because of limitation of time, I just want to raise 2 points. The first point is that although I generally agree with Dimitri's description of the nature of strategic convenience of strategic relationship between Moscow and Beijing, but I would like to point out that just in the past months, maybe less than 1 year, and in Beijing side, there's really emerging deep sympathy toward Putin's dictatorship. And I think that Mr. Putin also maybe have an affirmative point of view toward China's political, arrangement at home. And the second part is that if there is increasing severe Cold War, just a Cold War between China and the United States, and I think that it's very difficult for Europe, not on strategic front and on human rights front, not generally, and take a compatible position with the United States, just like Russia also will take a compatible position toward China. But if China and the United States really and very clearly in the process of going into a hot war, major conflict, I think every other great powers, Europe, Russia, and Indonesia in that purpose, and Brazil and Iran and India, all of them will take an increasingly neutralized position toward the world politics. They will not follow, and whether Washington or Beijing go into a load, into a major military conflict, which is definitely damaging, and all of those powers, the fundamental security and their fundamental philosophy of what kind of world it, in a minimum degree, it should be.
Thank you.
So in short term or in midterm, maybe we can find something a little like the bilateral, bipolar trend. But in long term, I think that this would definitely will become more multipolar, and with, at least with Russia, Europe, and India, and some other great powers become more independent than today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Rosa, let me turn to you now, and Iran is really a case, particularly if we think about the way in which the nuclear question has evolved, that at the same time points to, in a sense, sort of Europe at its best and Europe at its weakest. So, you know, Europe at its best, indeed, in many respects, I think we can look at the Iran deal back in 2015 and the sort of, you know, over a decade of negotiation that led to it as a sort of, well, I would say is probably the EU's greatest foreign policy success, both internally and internationally. I mean, internally because of the format through which it was achieved, and obviously internationally because of the significance of the deal itself. At the same time, obviously, what has happened since then, and in particular what has happened over the last 4 years, in a sense, is kind of Europe at its worst. You know, Europe that is unable to, even in areas like the economy, where, you know, forget the defense domain, but, you know, the economy, I mean, we're used to thinking that this, you know, at least here, the European Union is a power. And yet, you know, when faced with the US extraterritorial, or rather the threat of US extraterritorial sanctions, you know, all our weakness was revealed. Now we're in another phase yet. So I would really sort of like you to reflect from perhaps the lens of Iran and of the Iran nuclear question. How, you know, what does this tell us about Europe's role in the world?
Thank you. Thank you to you, Nathalie, and to Ricardo for the invitation. I've been listening to everyone else, and I think some of it I can agree with, some of it I'd like to unpick a bit. But let me start with your question. As I was listening to the others and I was listening to your question, it actually reminded me of a modern classic, if you will, Douglas Adams' book, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's an alien living on Earth for 15 years, and then he's supposed to amend the entry on Earth, and he changes it from harmless to mostly harmless. And I think if you're looking at what people in Tehran think of the European Union, I think their entry in that encyclopedia would be mostly useless. Now, that's not fair, but it does have some merit because of exactly the things that you've mentioned. And I think what makes that sentiment even more worrisome is the fact that it's no longer the prerogative of the most anti-Western hardline factions in the political elite, but it is becoming at least something more commonly held because of the experiences of the last 4 years. And so while the debate in Tehran, obviously, on what to do with the Europeans and what to do with Americans is a never-ending one, I think we have to remember that the nuclear agreement was the pinnacle. It was the high point of the idea that you could, through negotiations, reach an accommodation and a rapprochement with the West, if you will, but particularly with the Europeans and via the Europeans with the Americans. So that was the high point. And the 4 years after that have been the absolute disappointment and confirmation of the worst case aspersions cast on Europe and the United States by anyone in Iran. And so from the sense of, you know, even a clock that's not working will work at least twice per day, you can say on this one, the hardliners were right. You couldn't trust the Americans. And this is where we now come to Europe. You can't trust the Americans, but the Europeans were playing ball. What happened to them? And so in Tehran, the question, of course, is that if not even safeguarding one of your own foreign policy objectives, which you reached, you know, based on your own kind of sound analysis of some kind of national interest, if you will, if that can't make you kind of rise to the occasion and stand on your own 2 feet, then what is going to make you do that? Now, obviously, we have to also remember that the Iranians are overestimating their own importance. Obviously, this is not the most important issue on anyone's desk in Brussels or any capital in a member state. That's fine. But I think it does point to something very important. What the EU could do with the agreement was to play the convener, a convener that had a momentum of trust with all the parties, and then incentivize, in this case, Iran, to comply to the agreement, not only to sign on, but to comply to the agreement through its economic relations. The problem being, of course, that Europe is not capable of sustaining the former, this convening, trusted negotiator, bringing everyone together, because it cannot sustain the latter. It cannot have its own economic relations with Iran, or for that matter, with anyone in the world, without taking American interests into account, and more importantly, American legislation. So in a sense, Europe's foreign policy, through its weak trade ability, is held in escrow in Washington, D.C. And that means, by definition, that reaching an agreement with Europe, or having Europe as the guarantor of your own dividends in an agreement, is pretty useless. Because if the United States is not playing ball, Europe is not going to be able to move. Now, you could, of course, say, well, that's fine. The transatlantic bond is the foundation of European foreign policy, et cetera, but the notion of strategic autonomy has already been mentioned. And the whole point of a strategic autonomy would, of course, be to be able to strike out on your own and to pursue an independent policy where none of your traditional allies would want to go with you. And I think that is the problem at the moment, is with Trump, everyone understood the need for strategic autonomy. And there was, in a sense, a boosting of the effort, of the discourse and the actual attempt, very shaky baby steps, to have something that could slowly, eventually, etc., blah, 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 European procedure, amount to strategic autonomy. But with Biden coming in into office, it seems a bit that everyone is so relieved that they somehow think that the burden of that kind of responsibility for your own foreign policy has been relieved. Because now Biden is there, and therefore we have a reasonable American administration again. And as Barbara was mentioning, the problem with that, of course, is that it's delusional to think that the status quo ante can somehow be reached again just because Biden is president. In 4 years' time, Mike Pompeo might become American president. And then nothing that has been signed so far is as ironclad as it looked when Biden signed it. So that means that the need for a strategic autonomy is actually independent on how much you like the person sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The whole point of strategic autonomy is that it's not a fair weather instrument. It's something that you're supposed to use when it's difficult. And nothing is going to be as difficult as being able to say no, or at least maybe, to an American president. Now, for the Iranian case, this is probably too late. Iran has been a bit of a canary in the coal mine, if you will. And whatever we're trying to do now in terms of strategic autonomy is not going to be built far enough to make a difference for whatever is going to happen on that issue. But I do note with some consternation, I think consternation is probably a too diplomatic word to use for it if we were in Tehran, is how the Europeans almost managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat after Biden was made president, elected president, because they were so happy that he became president that they were trying to anticipate his potentially somewhat harsher line on Iran, which ended up at times with Biden looking much more conciliatory than the Europeans, which, again, kind of brings into question how far can the Europeans go in trying to make up their mind on their own instead of constantly looking over their shoulders to see where DC stands. And I think, again, as a kind of last sentence, if you will, the idea that this is going to be something that will be less relevant the more reasonable an American president is false. And the idea that Iran was the first and maybe the last case is also delusional. There will be other cases. There are already other cases. And so all of these things that were somewhat slowly and hesitantly and not particularly impressively started to build in order to tackle the Iranian issue, like instincts, an attempt to build an independent financial instrument, All of those things are going to be as relevant in 4 years' time with any other case. And they're going to need to be there not only because of Europe being able to strike out on its own, it's also going to need to be there because of China and because of all the other poles in the world who are not going to take SWIFT and other, European legacy instruments into account when they're going to form their own foreign policy. And therefore, Europe will lag behind even more simply by the fact that the others are growing more important. Thank you.
Well, yes, I must say I totally share the analysis, and in fact I would go perhaps even further by saying that this is not just about what may happen in the next, sort of in 4 years' time, but I think there are a number of sort of structural aspects in US foreign policy. I mean, it's not as if the Biden administration says it refuses to make use of extraterritorial sanctions. Now, it's making this argument on Nord Stream where I think there's obviously politically, I think there's a stronger case to be made, but, compared to sanctioning over the JCPOA, but still, I mean, we're not talking about a diametrically opposite position from the Trump administration in this respect. But perhaps just very quickly, before I have a couple of questions on the chat function, Rosa, that I wanted to turn back to you on is, do you feel that given everything that has happened, now we're at a stage in which we are negotiating again, but do you feel that the potential, I mean, not so much what will actually be achieved, but the potential European role, precisely because of what has happened over the last 4 years, has actually diminished? There's less of a need, if you like, for Europe in the context of trying to get the JCPOA back up and running and obviously go beyond it.
No, I think, in a sense, whether all the parties like it or not, they're doomed to sit in a room together and figure something out because they all hold specific cards that the whole equation requires to work out. So, even if Biden had a much more convincing hold on the Senate than he does, he would still need years and years to unravel US sanctions, which means that the US cannot become a trade partner to Iran as an incentive for Iran to stay in the deal. It will still have to be Europe and the other signatories. But the problem here is a bit towards also what Rosa and others were discussing. It's also an intra-European thing. I mean, the whole Iran issue were kind of accidentally handed to the big three, who are now big two. And the big two, together with Britain, but particularly the French and the Germans, of late, in my opinion, have been doing this quite amateurishly. So I think in that sense, it also points to the fact that other countries that have been left somewhat out on this particular portfolio, like Spain and Italy and others, need to come in, not just in order to kind of rejuvenate what the European position is and be a bit more imaginative about what it can be, but also because I think it would be good to have, let's say, anthropologically very useful to have some new faces going to Tehran. Because I don't think the Germans and the French stand in very high regard there.
Absolutely. Let me turn to some of the questions on the Q&A function. And Barbara, let me turn this first question from Sumru Alto to you. That says, how realistic is the notion that the Biden administration can reconstruct the transatlantic order that was assumed to prevail over the Trump era? Are there not enormous changes in trade flows, technological developments, military competence that have been occurring for the last 30 years that cannot be undone by merely changing administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem is that not only can you not unsee the Trump administration, but you can't undo what the Trump administration did quickly or easily, or even really undo it at all in some respects. And in many areas, he's succeeded in changing the climate to the extent that the Biden administration is now locked into certain kinds of positions that it would not have taken, had things happened very differently in the last 4 years. And China is the big one. I mean, the US public opinion on the US and the bipartisan stance on China has shifted so dramatically in the last 4 years that the Biden just cannot do what he might have done otherwise. So it's a different world, and there's no going back to the old days.
And perhaps, Barbara, now that I'm on with you, a question that was actually kind of connected to a point that Rosa was making, but I'd like to ask you this question. I mean, do you think that we can reconcile question from Tom Sauer, reconcile extraterritorial sanctions with the notion of being allies? I mean, can you sanction your allies or threaten to do so?
You know, as a historian, I think about how I would explain these sorts of things in a textbook, and this is a tricky one. You know, it just doesn't, on the face of it, it seems so bizarre, and I think it is a huge, a huge problem, and something that is very difficult to reconcile with being the allies of first resort, and I think part of it has to do with the constraints that Congress exercises in foreign policy, increasingly.
Absolutely. Rosa, let me turn to you for a question from Marco Piretta that goes back to the sort of age-old question of the EU seat of the UN Security Council, and whether you think that, is this impossible simply because of internal dynamics within the EU? Should it be a long-term goal for the EU, or is this a no-brainer, not really an issue, not particularly important for the EU's global role?
Yeah, good question. It's an old one, as you say, and maybe parallel to that, there's also the debate within the EU on introducing qualified majority voting in foreign policy. And I think the EU, to be honest, is long past the time when institutional changes or symbolic changes will actually make a big difference on foreign policy capacity, foreign policy willingness, strategic vision, etc. At the UN, would it, I mean, yes, it would, the EU would have a common position that would have to put to the UN. Would it strengthen the UN Security Council? I don't think so. That's not the problem. Would it make EU member states converge more? I don't think so. It's top down. Ditto, similar argument I would make for QMV. Institutionally, again, moving back to the EU level, member states could exercise constructive abstention when they disagree with particular positions. They're not doing it. They're not doing it because they're using the Foreign Affairs Council in a utilitarian way to reach other goals, and therefore they're blocking one decision in order to reach other goals, or because they fundamentally disagree with each other. And institutional or symbolic changes have not helped the EU get over these decisions. So it has to be something else. It can't be through institutional architecture or treaty reform. It's going to have to be something else that's going to make the EU member states move forward together.
Yes, I share your view, Rosa. I mean, I think that obviously it would be nice to have, but in a sense, if it happened, it would be more of a symptom of something that is starting to go right, in a sense, rather than a cause of things beginning to go right. Riccardo, I know that you had a question. Given that you're here, yeah, exactly. Here you go.
Yeah, here I am. Thanks, Nathalie. I do have a question to Rosa, which, however, can be extended to Dimitri and Yinhong too, given that it relates to the triangle, which in the United States is very much spoken of, the triangle between Russia and China with this Iran appendix, so to speak, the anti-US coalition par excellence. So my first question to Rosa would be the following. I mean, I do understand, and I very much sympathize with the kind of view that you have relayed, or at least I can understand where it comes from, the kind of view the Iranians have of the Europeans. And I share a good deal of those frustrations as a European expert who has been following the Iranian nuclear issue for so many years. But I wonder why, at the end of the day, the Europeans were the ones who did take up a political position against the US withdrawal. They remain committed. They were the most vocal in defending the JCPOA. The very concept, the very promise of a more normal relationship between Iran and the rest of the world entailed in the JCPOA. Yes, they did fail to honor their economic commitments because of the extraterritorial reach of US sanctions, but they were not the only ones. I mean, Russia and China did cut off economic ties with Iran as the European state, and especially China might have had a greater leeway to use its massive internal market and state-run banks in order to get around US sanctions. To an extent, it has done so, but it hasn't been so vocal. So why is it that this harsh treatment is only reserved for the Europeans and not for the Russians and the Chinese? And second, it's very much related to this question is, if Iran isn't interested in Europe any longer, given that Europe and a normalized economic relationship with Europe is what would allow Iran to keep a degree of strategic independence foreign policy-wise, because otherwise it would have to fall back on Russia and China. So is this a strategic calculation that is being matured, so to speak, amongst at least Iran's conservatives, that siding with Russia and China is the best strategic choice Iran has, rather than mending fences to the extent it is possible with Europe and try to play cards in different tables.
Basically, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Certainly not in Beijing, only in Beijing and Moscow. And I would also like to have Dimitri's and Yinhong's view of.
Yeah, very briefly, because then I wanted to, if we have time, ask a Japan question. Rusbe.
Thank you. Well, I think to some degree you can say it's because the disappointment is greater. The expectation is much greater. I mean, the relationship between Iran and Europe goes back 200 years in terms of what Europe means in the Iranian collective imagination. And I think these are probably the last generations that you see in power now, who are very much formed by the idea of the West, both the US and Europe. I mean, many of these people who are in different positions in the Islamic Republic are still, they were educated in the United States or in Europe. I think that's going to change to some degree. And it's going to change for two reasons. One is this disappointment that Europe is so difficult to pin down. And because Europe, unlike China, has a lot of normative pretenses. So you would expect them, in a sense, to behave differently. No one has an issue with China doing realpolitik, because that's what they say that they're doing. Now you can say this is unfair to Europe, sure, but then very little of this has to do with fairness. So that's one. The other one is relative importance. You see, in Europe, we've been talking about multipolarity for some time, and a lot of people in Brussels are very happy about the whole concept of multipolarity. But it seems to me sometimes that it doesn't really sink in, that it also means a relatively less important role for Europe and the West. It just doesn't mean that Europe has more to say vis-a-vis the Americans or some such. It also means that China has a different role in the world, and that when countries in the world are trying to calculate their position vis-a-vis various actors, China will play a larger role, not just in and of itself, but relative to others. So you can say that even if the JCPOA had worked in the sense that the Trump administration would not have left it, even if Trump wasn't elected, you would still see Iran having to look at China and Russia to a greater extent, because they don't want to put all their eggs in the European basket. Now, the shoe is on the other foot. So the conversation in Tehran is about, should we put all our eggs in the Beijing/Moscow basket? And I don't think anyone wants to do that. That is part of the domestic political football for those who want to basically undercut any future relationship with Europe by constantly saying, let's look eastward. Now, so there is a realpolitik argument to be made for doing that, but not to the extent of totally ditching Europe. But for Europe to remain relevant, to be a salient issue, Europe also has to do something. And the problem, in a sense, with the Trump administration time wasn't that Brussels didn't say the right things. It's just that this is like any good American hardcore detective movie, follow the money. And if there is no money coming, then you can talk as much as you like in Brussels. It makes no difference. And I'm not saying that to be facetious. I'm saying that in a very, very concrete sense. If people in Tehran who do go and vote within a restricted system every 4 years for a president, when their wallet becomes thinner rather than thicker, when the JCPOA is still, formally speaking, in effect, then why should they vote for someone whose main plank in foreign policy is to continue having a good relationship with Europe or even the United States? So that would be one of the reasons for why things have turned out the way they have.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. Before we close, I wanted to very, very quickly turn to a question by Akira Jego about Japan's role in rejuvenating the transatlantic relationship. And perhaps may I ask she and then perhaps Rosa for their two sides of the coin, if you like, response to that.
I would like to say very briefly, and I would like to say also very frankly, I think that among all the actors, Iran's foreign policy position is least to be jealous of, because the problem is not Europe. Even in some sense, the problem is not the United States. The problem is regional. For many, many years, and for reasons both from Tehran and Jerusalem, and Israel and Iran remain to be arch-enemy. And also at the same time, and for both reasons come from Tehran and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia and Iran has been remain to be arch-enemy. For China, Russia, I don't think that they will and very easily let them to involved too deeply in a very complicated and risky region of Middle East. In this sense, I personally believe that China's relation with Iran is more, in the nature of convenience than and in the much broader. Russia is the same. So I think that the Iran's future is in Iran's own hands. The most critical, but the most difficult thing is that how it is possible to find a way to mitigate substantially and protractedly relationship between Iran on one side with Israel and on the other side with Saudi Arabia. And I don't think that the China and Russia and Europe and even Washington could provide too much help in this kind of matter, which should be decided by Iran and its Middle East neighbors themselves.
Thank you. Rosa, perhaps a few words on Japan and the transatlantic relationship before we...
So I think the first thing, Japan's coming of age is actually very interesting, and the summit that took place a couple of weeks ago between the US and Japan was quite significant. Japan wanting to take a stronger role in Asian security. So in that sense, it's changing the security landscape, potentially changing the security landscape in Asia. Secondly, I think there are a lot of similarities and parallels, both historically, but also in terms of interests between the EU and Japan. And relations have been moving forward. Again, the US is the major security guarantor in that region, but on other issues, trade, cyber, there's a lot more collaboration between the EU and Japan. And if through the transatlantic relationship, but also through a broader network of alliances, Asia begins to be looked at from different partners in different ways, I think this will have positive repercussions on Asian security, and that is for sure. The EU has recently decided to embark on an Indo-Pacific strategy, so there is movement in the EU. And I think there'll be plenty of points of contact for the EU and Japan to work together on that front. So even if it might not have a direct impact on the transatlantic relationship per se, it is a different constellations and different relationships that will have spillover effects in dealing with regional security in Asia.
Great, fantastic. I really felt that I could have carried on for hours chatting to all of you, but at least the good news is that we're only at the beginning of the JOY project, so we will have the opportunity to discuss more over the weeks, months, 3 years that we have ahead. I hope, and I'm pretty sure that you've also enjoyed the conversation as much as I have, and especially I hope that those that have been following us have done likewise. So thanks very much for this fascinating discussion, and see you all very soon. Ciao.